right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully you can hear me. Welcome to the third and last presentation of Underwood Conservation District's Winter Workshop Series. My name is Tova Tillinghast and I'm the district manager here. You may already know who we are at Underwood Conservation District, but if not, I'll just mention a couple of things to get you acquainted. We are a local public agency guided by a volunteer board of directors made up of local landowners who are familiar with natural resources of our area. Our office is in White Salmon, but our work area includes all of Skamania County and western Klickitat County here in southern Washington state. We provide various services, including information, education, technical assistance, and site visits to help landowners address concerns and reach their land management goals. We even provide financial incentives for cost share for certain types of projects, and these have ranged from fencing, planting, livestock manure management, and projects like stream habitat restoration or wildfire risk reduction. Hosted in the evenings of December, January, and February, the UCD Winter Workshop Series has offered folks a way to stay connected and learning about important issues. And in December, we learned about stream restoration and some of the local efforts to improve habitat for fish and wildlife. In January, we learned about indigenous uses and sustainable harvest of native plants for health and wellness. And both of those webinars were recorded and can be viewed from our website. That's at www.ucdwa.org, and you'll find it under News and Events. Tonight, during our third and final winter workshop, we'll learn about common weeds of the gorge and what to do about them. Also going on at UCD this winter is our annual native plant sale, which runs from early December each year through the end of February, and many of our species have already sold out this year, but you can still find some plant availability and place your order directly on our website. Plant pickup this year will be on the third Saturday in March, and we are not planning a day of sale this year as we have in the past. So if you want to make sure you get your native plants, please place an order online as soon as you can from the inventory that we have remaining. And just as a reminder, you can find all of the most recent news and updates, including upcoming events and information about our plant sale by logging on to the UCD website and by signing up for the UCD e-newsletter. With me here is Jan Thomas, a resource specialist at the district. She will be our moderator for tonight's webinar, and she is now going to describe a few details as we get started with the presentation. Jan?
Yeah, thank you, Tova, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for this virtual workshop. I'm just going to run through a couple of quick logistics with you. A lot of us are familiar with the Zoom by now, but this is a Zoom webinar versus a meeting. So with about, looks like almost 30 of us on the line tonight, we are going to keep everyone muted from our side until the end of the presentation. We do welcome your questions, however, and you can enter them at any time into the questions box. You'll find that questions box in your control panel, which is marked Q&A. And just to make sure you can all see us and hear us, if I could get one or two folks just to enter a quick hello into the box now, make sure everything is working smoothly for us as we get started. Make sure everyone can find that question and answer box. Thank you. Yeah, hello. One of the other features we're going to take advantage of tonight to help make this presentation a little bit more interactive is both the polling feature and the question and answer box to answer a few questions that Emily's going to have for us during her presentation. So you'll see a poll pop up, and when you see that pop up, simply use your mouse and you can select the answers, and then we'll clear that poll once everyone's had a chance to respond. And when you're prompted, go ahead and answer her questions for you through that questions box that you have found now. We'll also, at the end of our presentation, we'll have kind of a formal question and answer period. And then at that point, we'll open the floor for those who would like to ask their questions directly. So if that's an easier option for you, please just click on that little raise hand icon, also in that control panel next to Q&A. And at that point, I'll unmute you and you can just ask your question directly. Just bear in mind that you will also need to unmute yourself before we'll be able to hear you if you're using that option. I think that's all that I have for logistics. If you're having any issues, you can also use that Q&A box just to type a message to me and I can try to help you troubleshoot on the site here. And that's everything, and I'll just turn it back over to you now, Tova, who's going to introduce our speaker.
All right, thanks so much, Jan. Jan works her magic in the background for us, and it really makes things go smoothly, so thank you. And thank you all who are attending tonight and for taking the time to be with us. As with many things these days, tonight's workshop is online as opposed to in person. And while we don't have the benefit of interacting face-to-face tonight, I know there are some benefits to being at home enjoying this presentation. And we at UCD are seeing increased participation in our events online, so that's also a positive outcome of these new and different times we're in. There are many other demands on our time, though, and I'm confident tonight's workshop will be a rewarding experience in many ways. We have the opportunity here to expand our understanding of local and common plants and to learn how to take responsible action in our own local environments in order to support healthy ecosystems and habitat. I hope we can all find ways to dig in and create positive change in our own backyards after learning from our guest speaker tonight. So with that, I'll introduce Emily briefly. Emily Stevenson has been the program manager for the Skamania County Noxious Weed Control Program for the past 7 years. We at Underwood Conservation District greatly appreciate her partnership in the area, often referring landowners to her for advice and frequently accessing her ourselves for technical expertise. She is passionate about her role as a weed warrior, and she also loves native plants, pollinators, and other wildlife. If you haven't already seen it, you should visit the lovely pollinator garden that she and her colleagues established at the Hedgewald Center next to the fairgrounds in Stevenson. And it demonstrates the values and beauty of native plant habitat. So as she encourages others to manage for noxious weeds, she inspires us all to work toward achieving a healthy balance among species. So thank you, Emily, for being here to share your expertise with us. And let's welcome Emily.
Okay, well, thank you guys. Can you hear me okay? Okay, let me just start sharing my screen here. All right, well, good evening. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the Underwood Conservation District for hosting these great workshops this winter. Let's just see here. There we go. Okay, so I've got a lot to cover tonight. Here's an outline of what you'll be learning. I'll start with an introduction about the weed law and weed boards in Washington and tell you a little bit about our program here in Skamania County. And then we'll cover some definitions and why you should care about invasive species. Before we talk about specific weeds and their control, I want to preface it with an intro to plant biology, which should help when you're trying to identify a weed and plan for control measures. I'm also going to share some resources that will hopefully help you after we leave here tonight. I'll finish up with some ideas about things you can do to minimize the impact of invasive species and how to make your own garden bountiful for you and your wildlife friends. Real quick, I want to mention I started my career surveying and mapping noxious weeds in the Gorge in 2005. And then I came to work for Skamania County in 2012 and worked seasonally for a couple of years before becoming the coordinator in 2013. So RCW 1710 is the weed law in Washington that establishes weed boards and gives them the authority to develop a noxious weed list and determine the requirements for control of those weeds, both at the state and county level. The state board is comprised of 12 members and 2 paid staff positions. They support 38 county weed boards and weed districts. Like I said before, they maintain the noxious weed list for the state, and they educate the public about noxious weeds through publications and events. Our county board consists of 5 members who are local volunteers, 4 of which must be involved in agriculture, and these folks help steer the direction of the local program. Every county is set up a little bit differently in the state. Some are standalone programs, some fall under WSU Extension or conservation districts, and some are part of county public works departments. Each county gets to decide how they fund their weed boards, and so some, like Skamania County, fall under the general fund for the county, while others, like Lookalikes County, are funded by a tax assessment. And I believe there are about 26 counties in the state who are funded that way. The county boards are also given authority to enforce the weed law. Here's an overview of how the Skamania County program was funded in 2020. Because Skamania County is largely made up of public land, we partner with those agencies to control noxious weeds on those lands. In 2020, 56% of our funding came through federal agreements, while 7% came from the state, and about 18% of our budget came from the county itself. Because of the agreements we have with agencies, we hire seasonal employees for the summer to execute those agreements and control noxious weeds on those lands. Here's our crew from last season. The program also assists private landowners with control of noxious weeds where feasible. This typically applies to Class A plant species. This is our top priority and highest concern because they have limited distribution and they pose the greatest risk. There are currently 5 Class A species found in Skamania County. We also get funding from the state for knotweed control on private land. I'll cover knotweed later when we talk specifically about plants, but this is something our program has been working on in both Skamania and Lookalikes counties since 2004. It's also our job to educate landowners about noxious weeds and remind them of their duty or responsibility to control noxious weeds on their own properties. This focus on outreach and education occurs in many forms. When there's not a pandemic going on, we host a booth at various events, including the county fair and then, of course, UCD's Tree Fest. We offer home surveys in Skamania County where I can walk the property or look at a specific site with the landowner and talk about both weeds and native plants. And of course, we have our social media campaigns on Facebook and Instagram, and we've also been working to update our website. And then quickly, I want to mention a few other agencies we're working with either locally or in Washington who can be a resource for you. The Invasive Species Council, who works with all taxa, not just noxious weeds, have a strong presence online through their website and social media, and they even have their own app. This is where you can learn a lot more about invasive species and report anything you can find. The State Department of Agriculture encompasses a lot more than just weeds or invasive species, but some of their programs include regulations for nurseries and quarantining of pests or funding of certain projects like Spartina or knotweed. They also have a public education presence online. And then the Cooperative Weed Management Area in the Gorge is a local asset that I'll mention again when we talk about resources toward the end of the presentation. So now I'd like to go over some definitions, but first we'll start with the poll, and I'll see if there are also any questions so far. Let me just pull up the poll here. Can everyone see the poll okay? Looks like you can. We've got a couple of answers coming in. Yeah, so this is kind of a tricky question, but the simplest definition of a weed is any native plant, or excuse me, any plant, native or non-native, growing where you don't want it. An example would be a Douglas fir growing in your garden. Doug fir is a native plant that serves a purpose in our landscape, but the veggie garden isn't the right place for it. So in that instance, even though it is native, the Doug fir would be considered a weed. So what is a noxious weed? This is more of a legal term. There are state and federally listed noxious weeds that are typically non-native plants that establish quickly and do harm to the economy, the environment, or public health. And then an invasive species can be a plant, animal, or a pathogen that is not native to an area, that spreads quickly and does harm. This sounds like the definition of a noxious weed, but keep in mind, all noxious weeds are considered invasive, but not all invasive weeds are noxious. So I've used the term native and non-native a couple of times, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page there too. Native plants refer to those that have evolved over hundreds or thousands of years, the ecosystem in a particular region. When I say native, I typically mean native to the Pacific Northwest. And in the US, native refers to those plants found prior to European settlement. Note that some books or things you find on the internet can label a plant as native, and what they mean is native to the entire US, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually native to the Pacific Northwest. For instance, there's a plant on the noxious weed list in Washington that is native to the East Coast, but it did not evolve here and it has invasive tendencies. And just for your information, that plant is indigo bush. Non-native plants are introduced with human help to an area or region where it did not naturally evolve. One thing to note, not all native plants are invasive. Excuse me, not all non-native plants are invasive. Other terms you might see include exotic or alien species. These terms are still referring to those plants that did not evolve here. So a couple of things to keep in mind with the non-native plants is that though many of them do not and cannot reproduce or survive naturally without human help, some of them are actually very good at taking advantage of their surroundings. And because they do not have natural predators to keep them in check like our native plants do, they outcompete more vulnerable species. This is what makes them invasive. So why do we care? Well, for one, it's costly. Invasive species cost Americans more than $137 billion annually. For farmers and natural resource managers, such as timber managers, it decreases their yield and impacts their income. A recent study showed that Scotch Broom affects the soil nutrient levels for many years and actually lowers the germination rate of Douglas fir seedlings and impacts the rate of growth of planted trees. So if you're in the business of producing timber, this could really hurt your production level and your bottom line. Other ways they can affect our economy is by causing a major disruption on our hydroelectricity systems or even salmon populations. For example, if zebra or quagga mussels establish here, they will clog pipes and filters, especially at our dams, as well as change the ecosystem and food sources critical for native fisheries. Invasive species can also affect recreational boating and fishing, hunting and hiking, which would be a detriment to not only our sanity, but to the economy as well. Invasive species are also a detriment to our health. Some species are toxic and even fatal to humans and livestock. Invasive species can increase the frequency and intensity of wildfires, and they affect water quality by destabilizing soil and altering the hydrology of streams, rivers, lakes, and wetlands. They're also damaging to our environment. After wildlife, they alter wildlife habitat, contributing to the decline of endangered species. They outcompete natives that are beneficial to wildlife, some of which rely solely on a particular plant. You may have heard that the monarch butterfly relies solely on milkweed as its only host source, or the Fenner's blue butterfly seen here that relies on 3 specific species of lupin throughout its life cycle. Invasive species also upset the balance of diversity by outcompeting and creating a monoculture of plants beneficial to few. So what can we do? Well, I'll come back to that later, but now I want to switch gears a little and talk about plants. The first step in learning how to control weeds is to first is to first positively identify the plant you are seeking to control. Learning what plants are growing in your garden will help you understand your needs, develop goals, and set priorities. It's the first step in knowing what comes next. I have a couple of slides on some of my favorite resources or tools for identifying plants. And the first of these are books. One of my favorite books includes Weeds of the West. This covers the entire western region of the US, so it will include some species that may not grow in our area. And it also includes some native plants that can be weedy, especially in agricultural areas. And it doesn't always supply that information on whether or not it is native or not. So be aware of that. The Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast is another local favorite. It mostly has native species in it, and it often includes information about how Native Americans use those species. And just keep in mind, the more you get to know your native species, the easier it will be to recognize the weeds that don't belong. Another weed book is by it's Northwest Weeds by Ron Taylor. It's a little smaller than Weeds of the West, and it does a better job of pointing out native versus not. Wildflowers of the Pacific Northwest is a great book. It's organized by color, which can help in narrowing something down. If you're out hiking and see a flower with a white flower, you can skip to that section. And it too identifies if it's a native or introduced. And then the last book on my list is Russ Jolley's book, Wildflowers of the Columbia Gorge. This is a great one to have, especially if you live in an area or recreate in the gorge. It's specific to our area. It has specific locations for flowers, and it also talks about timing of bloom. And then there's one new book that's coming out by the authors of the Wildflowers of the Pacific Northwest, and it's going to be just on weeds, and likely it'll be published in 2022. So the second tool is, of course, the internet. There are many websites out there that you can help you identify plants, but I picked out two to share tonight. The first is the State Noxious Weed Board has an Identify a Weed tool that allows you to search for by key characteristics. It is somewhat limited because they only have the noxious weed list and the monitor list on there, so keep that in mind, but it is a great tool. The second is the Burke Herbarium at the University of Washington. On this website, you can search by characteristics or location, and there are over 4,000 plants in their database. There are many other websites out there that can be helpful, but remember, plants typically have more than one common name, and some species share common names. And also, it doesn't hurt to use more than one source to see if you're coming up with the same answer. And then if you've got a smartphone, there's probably an app for that. Washington Wildflowers is an app that was collaborated by the folks who wrote the Washington Wildflowers book that I talked about earlier. And it's a collaboration between them and the Burke Herbarium, as well as an app company. It is free, but that has a limited number of species, or you can pay a small one-time fee and you get 870 species. It lets you browse their database, or you can search by characteristics, and then it'll give you options, including a range map and timing of flower. The nice thing about it is it can be downloaded to your phone, so if you're out hiking, you don't need cell service in order to use it. It's also available on both Android and Apple platforms. iNaturalist is another one of my favorites. It includes all taxa, and what you do is create an account which allows you to keep track of your observations. It has a handy feature on this app that allows you to take a photo, and if the plant or insect or whatever you're photographing is unknown to you, it will actually allow you to view suggestions from iNaturalist. If you take a really good photo, or even multiple photos that shows the leaves, flowers, or fruit, and then click on it, and then it narrows it down and shows you possibilities of what that plant might be. And it's based on the photos you gave them, but also your location. So it's going to use other observations nearby to increase the likelihood of a positive identification. Keep in mind it is definitely not foolproof. For various reasons, it cannot always give you a 100% positive ID, but what it can do is give you a place to start some further research into a more confident positive ID. A few more tools to aid in your plant ID before we move on. There's a number of great resources out there that have published for weed IDs by local agencies. The most relevant one to our area is Worst Weeds of the Gorge, which covers mostly early detection rapid response species. There are paper books that are available, and I have some in my office if you're interested, but they're also available digitally. So if you see a code like that, it's on the screen now, called a QR code. And what you do is you put your camera phone up to that, turn on your camera, and it will actually go to the website and allow you to download the PDF to your phone. Two other publications that the State Weed Board has published are divided between Western and Eastern Washington. These are more common noxious weeds and are organized by bloom color. We are in the transition zone here in the Gorge, so I always have both on hand. And you can get these from me as well, or download them from the State Weed Board website. And then finally, the last tool is an easy one. You can contact your local noxious weed board. You can email us photos, one or several is better. Make sure that they're close enough to the leaf pattern, but also you can get a picture of the entire plant, which is helpful too. And if it's flowering, please include that. You're also welcome to bring in a sample to the office. If you're going to do that, I recommend cutting the plant right prior to you bringing it in so that it's not wilty. Once again, we do offer home surveys, and you can request one of those at any time. So I want to cover some plant biology 101. And knowing if you have a monocot or a dicot will help determine what type of herbicide you need to use, should you choose that type of control. Mono means one, and cot is short for cotyledon, which are the first leaves to appear from a germinating seed. Monocot leaves have parallel veins. Some examples of monocots are grasses, lilies, irises, and orchids. A dicot has two cotyledons, and the leaf veins are branching. Shrubs, many trees, and broadleaf plants are examples of dicots. And then, of course, there are others that are neither monocot or dicot, and those are our conifers or ferns or mosses. So knowing the life cycle of a plant will help determine the best way to control it. An annual completes its life cycle in one season. The seeds germinate and grow, flower, and produce seed, and then die. The only mechanism for spread of an annual is by seed. This is important to note because if you can control the plant before it sets seeds, then you've controlled future generations. A biennial plant takes 2 years to complete its life cycle. The first year, they are often in the form of a low-growing rosette while the roots develop. The second year, the plant bolts, flowers, and produces seed, and then dies. The primary means of reproduction is by seed, much like an annual. A perennial plant typically lives longer than 2 years. It can be an evergreen plant or an herbaceous, where the top of the plant can die back in the winter while the roots are still alive and begin to grow again in the spring. Perennials spread in multiple ways, so just controlling seed production can impact future generations, but it does not necessarily control the existing population. Figuring out how a plant reproduces is also important. Most plants produce seed, but this isn't the primary way of reproducing for some species. Rhizomatous and solaniferous plants use their root system to expand and colonize. Rhizomes are underground plant stems that can send up lateral shoots. Stolons or runners are above ground stems that creep along the surface and grow a clone, much like a strawberry. Plant fragmentation occurs when a small piece of the plant is broken off or cut and grows new roots to start a new plant. Many houseplants and aquatic species reproduce this way. Some plants have tubers or bulbs, which can be split or divided to start new individuals. So why is this important? Knowing the biology and life cycle of the plant and how it reproduces will help determine the most effective ways to control it. Now that we know how to identify the plant and what to look for once it's identified, we can understand what will be an effective means of control. Integrated pest management, or IPM, is a holistic approach to preventing or dealing with a pest. Instead of just reacting to a pest problem, IPM focuses on understanding why you have the problem and utilizes multiple strategies to change the conditions, allowing the pest to thrive. It also plays a key role in preventing pests in the first place. IPM uses a combination of control methods, including mechanical control, cultural control, biocontrol, and chemical control. Proper timing of control is part of IPM, as well as taking actions to prevent pests in the first place and monitoring things along the way. IPM will not only help you get the most bang for your buck, but it will also decrease risks to people or the environment. I do want to mention that there is a difference when talking about controlling a weed versus eradicating. Controlling weeds typically means not letting weeds reproduce. This can be as simple as deadheading a plant to keep it from going to seed. Eradication means getting rid of the plant completely, not just controlling its spread. This will be important when determining what is required by law. So in terms of control methods, here are some of my favorites. For manual or mechanical control in small situations, I love the Hori Hori Japanese gardening knife. This is a great tool for digging and is really helpful when planting. The hula hoe is great for quickly and effectively getting those young plants uprooted and doesn't require you to be on the ground. A weed wrench is a simple tool with a long handle that is used as a lever. The teeth at the bottom wrap around the base of the plant and you pull the lever to uproot the plant. This is often used in small Scotch Broom control areas. Solarization is also an easy and effective way to control weeds before planting. By sealing off an area, you essentially cook the seeds in the soil or stimulate growth that will die quickly once germinated. Having enough moisture under the plastic to start with is key, and using a clear plastic is better than black. You must be sure to trap the air and the moisture, so if you get any holes in the plastic, it won't work. Downsides to this method is that you end up with a lot of plastic. Sheet mulching or lasagna gardening is another favorite tool I utilize. By using newspaper or cardboard, you can shade out weeds or grass while also improving the soil structure and building up the organic matter content needed for healthy plants. There's a lot of material available on the web about these methods if you're interested. And also just to let you know that a lot of my recommendations tonight will be for small gardens or smaller infestations. And if you have a larger area or an infestation that you need help with, just please reach out anytime. So we're going to take another poll. This one you'll be able to answer in the comment box. So tell us what your favorite tool or control method is for weeds in general.
Emily, while folks are putting in their favorite control method there, I did have a question for you. Could you spell the name of the first tool that you mentioned? Before the hoe, there was...
Right, the Hori Hori.
Hori Hori.
That is just H-O-R-I. Hori Hori.
Thank you. And then folks, just a reminder, if you want to just type into the questions box there, you can type your favorite tool or control method for weeds. What do you use when trying to get rid of weeds in your space? And Emily, there's one more question in here. The question, I wanted to plant some flax. Do you know if it can be invasive?
Well, there is some native flax, so I would go with that. I'm not too sure about some of the other flaxes, but there is a native one, so for sure do that.
Okay.
I love my Hori Hori, yeah.
Yeah.
Pulaski, that's a good one. Okay, yeah, this is great. All right. Well, another control measure that I want to talk about is biocontrol. And this can be used in certain situations. Biological control uses living organisms to control pests by predation, parasitism, or other natural mechanisms. Invasive or non-native weeds lack natural predators. Scientists travel to the native range of that plant and study the predators controlling them there. Then they return to the US and study the insects or pathogens in a controlled or closed system for years, a decade or more, before they can release it on the plant. This rigorous testing ensures the predator is host specific and will not affect any of our native species or those being grown for agricultural purposes. One that you may be familiar with is the Cinnabar moth. This moth was released in the 60s to help control tansy ragwort. It's widespread, but unfortunately it was one that wasn't quite tested long enough, and so it's no longer available because it does feed on some of our native plants. There have been successes in biocontrol, and one of those is with the introduction of a flea beetle that feeds on leafy spurge. These pictures show the difference it made in about 6 years. One thing to keep in mind about biocontrol is that it cannot be used in every situation. First, not all weeds have biocontrols approved for use. Also, biocontrol is used primarily for large, well-established infestations and where other control methods are not feasible. Please note, biocontrol is a long-term management strategy where desired results are not seen for many years and it can fluctuate over time. It's never going to eradicate a problem weed, but it will reduce the impact of an invasive weed to a level with which we can tolerate or manage. Chemical control should be used as a last resort, and you should make a habit of reading the label of the product you intend to use prior to use. The label is a legal document full of information, and so if you need help understanding anything on the label, please reach out. I'm happy to help, and the National Pesticide Information Center also has a hotline you can call for help or more information. The label is going to tell you everything you need to know in terms of what personal protection equipment you should wear, what weeds the chemical is effective on, if it should be used with an adjuvant, and also mixing instructions with the amount that you should be using to be effective. Keep in mind, more is not always better. Many times I've heard from landowners who put in a little extra just to be sure, but in some cases this can actually be counterproductive. Instead of translocating to the roots, the overdose quickly burns the top off before it has a chance to work through the system. Also, the opposite is true as well. If you use too little of the suggested rate, the plant could not completely die and could, in some cases, become resistant to that particular chemical. So I say all this to say, use the suggested rate that is written on the label. I do want to briefly touch on using synthetic chemicals versus organic. It's easy to think that an organic chemical is safer to use or less toxic than its synthetic counterparts. That's not always the case. For example, when comparing glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, to vinegar, the #1 suggested home remedy for weeds, we can look at the EPA's toxicity rating, or LD50. This is the lethal dosage, or the individual dose required to kill 50% of a population of test animals. The lower the number, the more toxic the material. So for glyphosate, the LD50 is greater than 5,000. With vinegar, it's a little over 3,300 milligrams per kilogram. So when they tested these two on rats, vinegar is actually more toxic than Roundup. Also keep in mind the stuff you find at the grocery store for vinegar is around 5% acetic acid. But what's needed for weed control is 20% or greater. This is a super dangerous level where you will definitely need eye protection and gloves when handling it. Also, Using vinegar can change the pH of your soil, and one application does not usually kill the plant. You will need multiple applications, and that increases the likelihood of changing your soil. Vinegar is also not regulated for garden use, so it can actually be more toxic to pollinators and insects more than you think you know. So do your research. When looking online, look for articles or discussions on reputable sources like universities and extension services. There's a great document on the Xerces website as well about organic pesticides. And remember, the dose makes the poison. Risk is a combination of the degree of exposure to the active ingredient and the inherent toxicology of the material. If the product is used according to the label, there should be little risk in its use or your contact with it. Other things to note about chemicals is that they come in different forms. Some are used to control seeds in the soil, prohibiting them from germinating, and then others are used on emerged plants. There are some selective herbicides that will kill broadleaf plants but leave grass unharmed. And then there are others that are non-selective, and they will kill just about any plant that it comes in contact with, including grass. Again, read the label. Most questions can be answered by reading the label. One last thing, the CWMA has put together documents on specific weeds that covers how to identify and what control measures are most effective. These are available for use and can be found on the CWMA webpage. Okay, here's another poll before we start talking about weeds. What is your favorite weed to hate? And you can go ahead and put that in the Q&A box.
And while people are putting their favorite weed to hate in there, we do have one question. Any update on Scotch Broom midge? Talking about the biocontrols.
Yeah, so there are a couple of biocontrols on Scotch Broom already. Not exactly sure about the midge. The ones I'm most familiar with are seed weevils, and they will not necessarily kill the plant, but they feed on the seeds. So in essence, they're kind of controlling future populations of Scotch Broom. I'm seeing vinca, quackgrass, western salsify, bishop's weed, thistles, some of my favorites, Himalayan blackberry, tansy, yes, of course, Russian olive, thistle and poison hemlock. Okay, yep, I will definitely cover some of these in my next slides. So I've got the next part of the presentation broken down into 3 groups. I'll talk about common weeds we often see in our gardens or just about anywhere. And then I'll talk about some weeds that hopefully you haven't seen too many of, but should keep an eye out for. These are our early detection rapid response species. And then I'll finish with some weeds that started out as ornamentals, or maybe even still being sold as an ornamental, that you should avoid. But first, I want to quickly describe some state weed lists that I'll be talking about. So there are 3 classes of noxious weeds on the state noxious weed list. Class A weeds are the non-native species whose distribution in Washington is still limited. They are also often extremely aggressive and hard to control, and those are our top priority weeds. Class B noxious weeds are non-native species whose distribution is limited to portions of Washington state. Often there's a weed like Scotch Broom that is ubiquitous on one side of the state, but not on the other. And then our Class C weeds consist of those weeds that are widespread in Washington or are of special interest to the agricultural industry. Some of the noxious weeds are also on a quarantine list. This list prohibits the sale or distribution of these plants or plant parts, including seeds, into or within the state of Washington. The purpose of the monitor list is to gather more information on suspect weeds, as well as monitor for their occurrence or spread. Anything can go on the monitor list, and there are no legal or regulatory aspects of the plants on this list. So the first weed I want to talk about is Groundzil, common Groundzil. This is a Class C noxious weed. It's a winter annual that typically germinates either in the fall or winter. It can produce multiple generations per year. The seeds are wind dispersed, and it's toxic to most mammals, including humans, if ingested. The leaves are deeply lobed and with toothed margins that can make it appear kind of wavy. This plant can be easily pulled or dug. Flowers can mature to produce seeds even after being weeded. So if they are flowering or even have seed on them, be sure to throw them in the garbage and not the compost. And this is really a good rule to follow for all weeds. If there are flowers or seeds present, discard them in the garbage and not in the compost. This is one you've probably seen or remember because of its size. Common mullein is a biennial. It forms a rosette in the first year and then bolts, flowers, and sets seed in the second year. Seeds are viable for 35 plus years. It has been used medicinally, and also I think it's a great substitute for toilet paper if we ever have a run on that again. But it is a host of insect pests, so it's probably not one that you want to keep around in your garden. This one is also easily pulled or dug. Common cat's ear or false dandelion is a Class C because of its toxicity to livestock. It's commonly found in lawns, pastures, and disturbed waste areas. It's a perennial. It's similar to common dandelion, except the flowering stems branch on cat's ear. The leaves are not as delicate as dandelion and are hairy, not smooth. The longer stems that are typically leafless exude a milky sap. This one reproduces primarily by seed, and it's easier to dig or pull up than dandelion, I think. Nipple Wort, you can find it in disturbed areas, including garden beds or driveways. It's an annual, so it reproduces by seed, and it does have a lot of seed. And I think most of that seed tends to germinate the next year. It typically has a single hairy stem that branches toward the top just below the yellow flowers, which are about the size of a dime or a penny. It is often browsed early by rabbits, but it still will grow back, usually multiple stems, and will flower and set seed. It does have a milky sap, and again, because it's an annual, it's easy to control if you get it before it sets seed. Pokeweed is widespread in the Portland and Vancouver metro area, making its way into Skamania County. I've seen it on the west side, and then I've also seen it up Cook Underwood Road. This plant is actually native to the southeast U.S., but it's invasive in our area. It's a perennial, growing anywhere from 2 to 8 feet tall. It has smooth, stout, purplish stems that branch extensively. The egg-shaped leaves on stems have smooth edges and are about up to 12 inches long and 4 inches wide. Flowers are white or green and form in elongated clusters that hang from branches in early summer. Those flowers then turn into hanging clusters of berries that turn a deep purple when mature. Fruits are present from midsummer to late fall. All plant parts are toxic to humans and livestock, although apparently cooking it can make it edible. Manual digging can be effective with this plant, but it does have an extensive root system, apparently one that can get to the size of a bowling ball. And so pulling or digging it in the early season is best, or when the plant is small. Resprouts can occur from remaining root fragments, so these should be discarded in the trash, not the compost. But stems, flowers, and leaves can be composted. At a minimum, cut the berry clusters and discard it in the trash. That way birds aren't locating it to new areas. I have heard that it takes multiple years of treatment to eradicate this plant. Bull thistle is a biennial. First year is a rosette before it grows about 3 to 7 feet tall in the second year. The bracts at the base of flower heads are spine-tipped. The flowers are purple and stems are spiny-winged. The upper leaf surface is rough with bristles like spines, while undersides are covered with white woolly hairs. The easiest way to control bull thistle is to take a shovel to the base of the plant and sever the root. Canada thistle, on the other hand, is a creeping perennial. It grows anywhere from 2 to 5 feet tall. The pink flowers are clustered toward the top of the stem, and the stems are not winged like the bull thistle, but are grooved. It reproduces by seed, but primarily by rhizome. As you can see in the bottom photo, the roots go very deep, making it almost impossible to control via digging or pulling. When the root is broken, it will regrow, usually with more than one plant. It's best to use a systemic herbicide, something that will get down to the root system. And this is one that we have a BMP for. Also, I just want to mention that there are many thistles that are native to our area that often get misidentified for invasive ones. There's a great article or document on the Xerces Society website about native thistles, and you should refer to that. Blackberry. This is probably one we're all aware of, but maybe a couple of things that you did not know is that there are 2 different invasive species of blackberry and also a native one. The Himalayan or Armenian version of blackberry is the most common and ubiquitous species that can be identified by its palmately compound leaf structure seen in the top right photo. The other invasive blackberry is a cutleaf variety that has a deeply divided and lobed leaf surface or leaf structure. Both are Class C noxious weeds. Both are sprawling, robust perennial shrubs that have arching canes that when they touch the ground, they root at those tips. And of course, you probably already know, they create impenetrable thickets. You can control small infestations of blackberry by pulling or digging the roots, or repeated mowing also works for controlling blackberry. And when I say repeated mowing, I mean throughout the growing season, not just once a year. You want to exhaust the root system. Long-term grazing from goats can be effective, and I've also heard that pigs can help with control by grubbing out the root balls. Please note that if you have a large thicket that you want to mow, try to do that in late summer, fall, or winter to avoid nesting bird season, which occurs from about February to July. The combination of mowing and herbicide works well for blackberry. Mowing first cuts down on the amount of herbicide that is needed. You must wait a few weeks after the mowing before applying an herbicide to hit the regrowth. We've had better luck treating in the fall after the first rains, but before frost. This plant is naturally sending sugars back to its root system to be stored for the following season, and so herbicide is more effective at killing the plant at that time. And this is another one that we have a BMP for. And then here's the native version. It's a little daintier than the invasive ones, but it's still very hardy. It's low growing and does not form the large overarching canes, although it can be a trip hazard. It has slender trailing stems, densely covered in small prickles or thorns, and often the stems are covered in white powder that can be rubbed off, as shown in the left photo. Native bees love to visit these flowers, and although the fruit is smaller than the invasive one, I think it has more flavor. Just a personal experience. Scotch Broom is a Class B noxious weed required for control in Skamania County. This is a perennial woody shrub in the pea family. Seeds are viable for 80 plus years and are toxic to livestock and wildlife. Scotch Broom also increases wildfire risk. It forms dense thickets and it burns readily due to oils within the plant. It's also allelopathic, which means the roots release chemicals into the soil that inhibit germination of seeds from other plants, and this enables it to dominate the site. There are other brooms on the noxious weed list, but those don't typically occur in Skamania or Klickitat counties. It is possible to hand pull or dig small plants, but try to minimize soil disturbance. Repeated mowing sometimes works, and I've heard of some success with cutting plants at the base of the soil, but this has been pretty random, with some plants being controlled while others just regrow. Herbicide is often needed for larger infestations like the one you see on the bottom left. Herbicide should be used when the plant is not in flower in order to avoid harming bees that may be visiting the flowers. There is a biocontrol for Scotch Broom, like I already mentioned. The main ones that they're using are the seed weevil that doesn't kill the plant, but it does reduce the amount of seed produced, which limits future generations. There is also a BMP for this plant as well.
And Emily, we just have one quick question. If you could clarify, what is a BMP?
Yeah, so that is a best management practice. I'll talk a little bit about more about that, but it's basically a document that we've put together that kind of goes over the different characteristics of the plant. It talks about why it's an issue, and then it gives IPM or integrated pest management options for controlling the plant. So it's really just a lot of detailed information about the plant and how to control it.
Great, thank you.
So Herb Robert, or also known as Stinky Bob, is a Class B weed that you may be familiar with. This geranium is described as both winter and a spring annual, or a biennial. So yay! It's I've seen it blooming year round, so it's one of the reasons why it's so hard to control. Another not so great thing about this plant is that it can grow in both sun and shade and is highly adaptable to just about any situation. It's happy growing under a cool, moist forest canopy or on a hot, dry, rocky outcrop. It really does not have too many limitations, except that we don't see it that often on the east side of the state. But because it's tolerant to shady conditions, Herb Robert is a serious threat to our west side forests. It outcompetes our wonderful forest wildflowers, and it provides little to our wildlife friends. There is a native plant that has been mistaken for Herb Robert, seen in the top right photo, and that's bleeding heart. The foliage does look similar, but there are some key differences. For one, the geranium has red, hairy stems, while the bleeding heart stems are a pale green or almost white and are hairless. If it's blooming, the flowers are very different. The bleeding heart flower does resemble a heart and does not have the typical petals that the geranium has. Also, the geranium is shallow rooted, where the perennial bleeding heart spreads by rhizomes, and a cluster of plants tend to all be connected. Also, one of the most telling factors is the smell. When crushed, geranium has a pungent odor, whereas the bleeding heart does not. So for controlling Herb Robert, if you have a small infestation or a lot of time on your hands for a large infestation, you can easily control it by hand pulling. The key to controlling Herb Robert is to control it before it goes to seed and maintain that control until you've exhausted the seed bank. Herbicides, especially non-selective ones, are also effective. As with hand pulling, you have to treat geranium a couple of times a year and for multiple years to get it under control. Knapweeds. Generally, knapweeds pose a threat to pastures, meadows, and rangelands. They have little value as forage for wildlife and livestock. They decrease plant diversity and wildlife habitat, and they increase soil erosion and wildfire risk. There are several different species of knapweeds that are a concern in Washington, but I've included those that are frequently an issue just in our area. The first three species you see here are classified as Class B noxious weeds. The fourth species, spatula button, is not currently a noxious weed, but it is included on the monitor list. I included this species because I want you to be aware of it. This flower, largely naturalized in the Eastern Gorge, is not native to our area. It's very often included in those wildflower seed packets that you can find at just about any store, and it was more than likely introduced that way. It quickly spread away from the original intended garden and now grows along most of the roadsides and natural areas in the Eastern Gorge. Though the knapweeds do often provide a good source of pollen and nectar for pollinators, their presence can lead to a decrease in our native plants and the diversity that wildlife needs. So the detriments of knapweed do outweigh the benefits and therefore are required to be controlled. So controlling knapweeds, if you want to control bachelor button, this is a fairly easy one. It's an annual and it pulls out of the ground quite easily. If you can control the seed, then you can control the spread of bachelor button. Unfortunately for the spotted and diffuse knapweeds, these are the weeds that may be an annual or a biennial in its native range, but because of the conditions here, it can turn into a perennial. They both have a single large taproot, so they can still be pulled, but oftentimes if you break it off at the crown, the plant will just grow back. This is one of the reasons why mowing is not really a preferred control method. Mowing can reduce the amount of seed that is produced, but the plant, much like a dandelion, will grow back shorter and still flower and produce seeds. Meadow knapweed is perennial that has a larger spreading root system that reproduces when it is cut or broken at the crown. Digging is a little tougher because of the root system, but it can be done. There are biocontrol for knapweeds, so if you have a large infestation, this may be an option. But if you do have a large infestation, please call your local weed board for guidance with your management plan. Tree of Heaven is an introduced deciduous tree species that grows up to 80 feet tall and 6 feet in diameter. It produces a long taproot and suckers freely when cut, making it difficult to control. Creeping roots may extend out to 50 feet in all directions. Leaves are pinnately compound, meaning they have leaflets attached on each side of a central stem. Leaflets have mostly smooth edges, with one or two of the protruding bumps at the base called glandular teeth. Male and female flowers form in terminal clusters on separate trees. In late summer through autumn, Tree of Heaven produces large clusters of papery wings called samaras, each with a single central seed. The samaras vary from greenish yellow to red-brown and are often vibrantly colored in the fall. Another identifying feature of Tree of Heaven is the V-shaped leaf scars on the stem. Tree of Heaven can be easily confused with other trees that have compound leaves with many leaflets, such as sumac or walnut. The leaf edges of the lookalikes typically have teeth or serrations, while those of Tree of Heaven are smooth. Control of Tree of Heaven is not easy. If you cut it, it will grow back vigorously and produce multiple trees. And the herbicide is needed to kill the root system. And this is another one that we have a best management practice for. Tree of Heaven is a Class C noxious weed, but has recently moved up in the priority list because of this guy. This is the spotted lanternfly. This insect, native to Asia, feeds on a wide variety of plants, including just about everything we love to grow in Washington State, like apples, cherries, grapes, and hops. In Pennsylvania, where it was first detected in the US, it has decimated vineyards where it has killed well-established grapevines. Large populations also generate a lot of honeydew excretions, which can promote mold growth and also attract other insects. Its favorite host plant, as you may have guessed, is the Tree of Heaven. The spotted lanternfly has not yet been found alive in Washington or Oregon, though there were a couple of dead specimens that were found in a nursery shipment in Oregon last year. With all the shipping and movement within the US, this pest will likely make its way to the Pacific Northwest by humans, and so it's just a matter of time. So what can you do? Keep an eye out for this colorful insect. If you see it, report it. Also, if you or someone you know has a Tree of Heaven, remove it. And spread the word. You can find information about the spotted lanternfly on the Invasive Species Council webpage and other web pages. Please share on your social media accounts and with your friends and neighbors. So next I want to talk about our EDRR, or Early Detection Rapid Response species. These species distributions are limited in the state, and preventing new infestations and eradicating existing ones are still possible. The graph shows the correlation between the size of an infestation and the feasibility of control or eradication over time. Detecting and responding to new infestations early has the lowest impact and is the most cost-effective way to address the problem of invasive plants, short of preventing the problem in the first place. Shiny geranium is a Class B noxious weed, and it's still considered an EDRR species in Skamania and Clickatack counties, but unfortunately it's become too widespread in places to our west, like the Portland-Vancouver metro area. Because of its highly aggressive manner, we are doing everything we can to keep it under control here, and this is definitely one that we will need your help on. It's a low-growing annual that typically germinates in the fall. It has shiny green, round-to-kidney-shaped leaves that grow on red, hairless stems. At the end of the summer, leaves become red and waxy. It blooms from early spring to as late as July. It has small pink to purple flowers with 5 petals, grown in pairs on little stems. Sepals around the base of the flower are keeled with noticeable cross ribs, a key identification trait. And you can see that in the lower right corner picture. The shallow-rooted plant spreads by a forcefully ejected seed, helping it spread up as well as out from parent plants. With this method, it quickly dominates the landscape. It's easy to hand pull, but quickly can be too much if you don't get it early. You must follow up on control several times a year and for multiple years. We are currently controlling this plant on the forest and other places in Skamania County, and we are treating it twice a year in the spring and the fall. It does resemble the common dovefoot geranium, which is also a non-native plant that's typically found in lawns. Dovefoot is much hairier and does not have red stems. Brush skeleton weed is a Class B noxious weed that is widespread in parts of the state, including Klickitat County, but is still relatively limited in Skamania. This perennial grows 1 to 5 feet tall and is a huge threat to rangelands, pastures, and just about anywhere. It currently can be found growing along roadsides in Skamania, especially on the east end, where we've seen it on Highway 14 and up Cook Underwood Road. It has sharply lobed, hairless leaves from a basal rosette, similar to a dandelion, that withers as the flower stem develops. Other leaves on the stem are narrow and inconspicuous. Coarse, downward-pointing brown hairs on the lower 4 to 6 inches of the stem is a key identifying trait. Yellow flowers 3/4 of an inch in diameter are produced near the ends of stems, either individually or in groups of 2 to 5. It blooms from about July to September. Seeds are numerous and have fine bristles that aid in dispersal by wind. Brush skeleton weed reproduces by seed and root fragments. It has a large taproot, up to 7 feet long, which makes controlling it by pulling or digging almost impossible, since it can resprout from anything that breaks off. There are biocontrol agents for brush skeleton weed, but so far we've not seen a lot of success with them. If you think you have brush skeleton weed or you've seen it in Skamania County, please let us know. Yellow star thistle is a Class B that has invaded millions of acres in the West. It decreases forage for livestock and wildlife, and it causes chewing disease in horses. This is an annual or a biennial, and it spreads by seed. It grows 1 to 4 feet tall and has rigid stems that are extensively branched. Foliage may be dull green to gray, and they are covered in woolly hairs. It starts out as a rosette with deeply lobed leaves. Yellow flower heads have sharp spines around 1 inch long that surround the base. There is another star thistle which looks similar, but the flower is purple. Yellow star thistle is a lot more prevalent in Klickitat County, but we are just starting to see it spread into eastern Skamania County and the Underwood area. If you have this plant or seen it, please let us know so we can get it under control before it spreads too much more. Garlic mustard is a Class A noxious weed. This is one we've been dealing with in the Northwest for about 15 years now. Its distribution is still relatively limited in Washington, but it can be found on both the east side and the west side of the state, growing in our wet forest understory or along a creek in an arid eastern county. It is edible, so it was first introduced from settlers on the East Coast, probably for that reason. But keep in mind, it is illegal to grow in Washington, so don't be getting any ideas. This is a biennial or a winter annual. Rosettes form in the fall or by late spring in the first year, and it blooms April to June in the second year. It's typically 1 to 3 feet tall, but it's not uncommon to see a plant only 1 inch tall or up to 5 feet tall. It has a distinct S or L shaped curve at the top of the root. Basal leaves are kidney shaped and the stem leaves are more triangular. It has small, white, 4-petaled flowers that are able to self-pollinate. It produces many seeds that easily spread via anything that mud sticks to, including boots and tread. Another identifying characteristic is a pungent garlic odor when leaves are crushed. This plant is an extremely aggressive plant that produces a lot of seed that remains viable for at least 8 years. It also changes the composition of a plant community by exuding chemicals that disrupt plant growth and certain plant mycorrhizal fungi connections. This is known as allelopathy. It makes it much easier for the plants to dominate a site and quickly spread out of control. There are a couple of lookalikes for garlic mustard. The one that's most commonly mistaken for garlic mustard is our native saxifrage or fringe cup. The way to tell the difference is the stems and leaves on the fringe cup, which are seen on the left, are hairy, whereas they are smooth on the garlic mustard. And the flowers are also quite different. The other plant that sometimes gets confused with garlic mustard is Nipple Wort. This is an annual weed that we've already talked about that can be quite prolific if you have it, but doesn't form a rosette. It's quite hairy and has a yellow flower instead of a white flower. Knotweed is a class B that forms dense colonies and excludes native vegetation. Though it can grow anywhere, it poses the biggest threat to our riparian areas. There are several different species that are invasive in Washington state, but all are very similar. Knotweed is a perennial with an extensive root system that forms dense clumps and spreads by long creeping rhizomes. Stout, hollow stems are reddish brown to green with slightly swollen nodes, and they resemble bamboo. This plant does die back in the winter, but the tall, dead brown stems typically persist. It has large, heart-shaped leaves on short stalks, which are hairless. The Himalayan species has longer, slender leaves, and that's the leaf on the right side there. Flowers are small, cream-colored, and they grow in plume-like clusters in leaf axils and at stem tips. This blooms late summer through early fall. Tiny stem and root fragments can easily regenerate into new infestations, which is why it's become such an issue along our waterways. Natural flow and floodwaters transport those plant fragments downstream to new areas where a new infestation becomes established. Because of its large, extensive root system, it's extremely difficult to kill. Unless it's a very small infestation, it's almost impossible to dig up. This is one that requires the use of herbicide to control and eradicate. I mentioned before, we have a knotweed eradication project going in Skamania County, and we have an agreement with Klickitat County. So we received funding from the state for specifically knotweed control. We're able to work with all landowners to safely and effectively control knotweed infestation. So if you have knotweed and you're not in our program, please contact us today and we'll get you going. Puncture Vine. This is also known as goat heads. This is a class B that is fairly widespread across the western United States, including Washington, but is limited on the west side of the state. In 2019, it was discovered growing at the ball fields in Home Valley. This plant is toxic, but it also has nasty, sharp spines on its seed burrs that can cause damage to animals and people and can even puncture bicycle tires. This plant has had such a negative impact on the West. There's an entire event festival in Boise dedicated to education and outreach about this event, or about this plant. If you want to look more up about that, it's the Boise Goathead Fest. Puncture Vine is a summer annual, germinating when the soils have warmed. It doesn't take long for the yellow flowers to turn into spiny burrs, and if it's left unchecked, it just continues to grow and germinate throughout the summer. And if infestations are small, it is fairly easy to control. Because it's an annual, hand pulling or digging is effective. The key to being successful is to follow up often. With the infestation at the ballpark, we visit the site every 2 to 3 weeks throughout the growing season to get the newly germinated plants. If plants go untreated, seeds are spread very easily via shoes, tires, or anything that walks on top of it. Again, if you're in Skamania County or anywhere west of Klickitat County and see puncture vine, please report it. This is definitely not one that we want to get away from us. Butterfly bush is a Class B noxious weed, and it's on the quarantine list, although there are now sterile cultivars that are an exception to this rule. Those that are considered sterile produce less than 2% viable seed. This is a deciduous shrub reaching 15 feet tall. Flowers have forked petals and are commonly purple with an orange center and appear in showy flower spikes. Cultivars can be pink, orange, and white. Leaves are typically long and narrow and what are called lance-shaped. They're green to blue-gray above and whitish on the underside due to fuzzy hairs. Though butterfly bush is often planted in yards and gardens, it has escaped and become an issue along roads, railroads, and most problematic in our streams and rivers. It primarily reproduces by seed, which can then easily be carried downstream by the water. This plant could easily have been in my next section, where I will talk about ornamentals that have escaped, but I included it in the EDRR section because it's such a high priority for us in Skamania County. We currently have a large infestation we are dealing with on a creek near Beacon Rock, and unfortunately this infestation was out of control before we could do anything about it. It's going to take a lot of work and money to restore this creek, and so we are eager to find it on other creeks sooner if we can. Many people love butterfly bush because it's pretty and the pollinators do like it. But one thing you may not know is that butterfly bush is not a host plant for any pollinators, and so it does not provide the same amount of benefit as a native plant would. At this point, I'm not requiring anyone to completely eliminate butterfly bush in their yard. However, this could change, and if we find that it's a source for an infestation downstream. I do ask that you, at a minimum, deadhead the flowers and keep it from spreading seed, especially if you live near a waterway. But even if you don't live near the waterway, your neighbor's may, and they could end up with an infestation that started from your own house. So I would highly recommend replacing the butterfly bush with something more beneficial to wildlife, like a ceanothus or maybe a Pacific ninebark. As far as controlling butterfly bush, small plants can be hand dug or pulled, but cutting plants back to the ground will not control it. It can regrow in a short amount of time. If you have a large shrub or tree, you must first cut it and then paint the stump with an herbicide in order to kill the root system. Spurge Laurel is a Class B noxious weed. This is another one that is actually an escaped ornamental, but I left it under the EDRR section because of its priority in Skamania County. This is an evergreen shade-tolerant shrub. It grows to about 4 feet tall. It does resemble our rhododendrons, but the flowers are much different. Spurge Laurel has small, fragrant, inconspicuous yellow-green flowers that appear in clusters at the base of the leaves in winter, typically this time of year, January to February. The leaves are spirally arranged and abundant at shoot tips. They're narrowly oval, smooth, dark green, and shiny on the top, lighter in color underneath. Egg-shaped fleshy berries containing one seed start out green and ripen to black in early summer. All plant parts of this plant are toxic. This plant started out as an ornamental and escaped to nearby forests. Birds eat the fruit and then fly away, depositing the seeds elsewhere on the landscape, making it really difficult to find the extent of an infestation. Virgil Laurel is a problem in Skamania County, primarily between Stevenson and Bonneville Dam, though we found much smaller infestations further west. Years ago, it was planted on Thunder Island and Cascade Locks, and the birds spread it to surrounding forests from there. If plants are small, they can easily be hand pulled or dug with a shovel. Please keep in mind that all parts of the plant are toxic, so I recommend wearing gloves when dealing with Spurge Laurel. Large infestations, like the one we are dealing with around the Bridge of the Gods, are harder to control. A general herbicide application is tricky because of the thick, waxy coating. We've had good success with basil stem treatments conducted in the late winter. Regardless, if you have this plant or have seen it, please let us know so we can help get it under control. The last few weeds I want to talk about are escaped ornamentals. These invasive plants started out in our nurseries and were innocently planted in our gardens before we knew the damage they would cause. A widely example Widely known example of this is kudzu in the south. That plant wasted no time invading forests and completely overtaking houses. The policeman's helmet is a Class B noxious weed, and it's on the quarantine list. It's an herbaceous annual, and it has smooth and hairless stems that are also hollow with a pinkish tinge. It can range from 3 to 10 feet tall, and flowers vary in color from white to all shades of pink or purple, and the shape resembles the British policeman's helmet, hence the common name. Extremely invasive in moist areas, it was originally introduced and sold as an ornamental, but quickly escaped home gardens. It is easy to control as a very shallow root system that easily pulls out. But follow-up within the same season is advised, as well as for a few years following the initial treatment. This is one that could also been under the EDRR list, as we've started to see it pop up along roads and waterways on the west side of our county. If you see this plant, please report it. Creeping Jenny is not listed as a noxious weed, but it is on the monitor list. This plant is still widely sold today. It's very common in hanging baskets or sold as fast-growing ground cover. It seems delicate, but a recent discovery of it in North Bonneville along Hamilton Creek shows it competing quite well with reed canary grass. It can grow on land or in water, and in my own personal experience with it is that it's very difficult to kill. It can go months without water and can handle freezing temperatures just fine. The infestation along Hamilton Creek, likely started from yard debris dumping, is quite extensive and alarming. Because this plant is still widespread and very popular, it is not regulated, so I can't tell you not to purchase it or plant it. However, I'm highly encouraging you to choose another ground cover, or if you must have it, keep it contained in a pot or basket and dispose of it properly when you're done. Also, please do not share it. There is a native that has similar structure, and that's also known as yerba buena or Oregon tea. This is a perennial herb that has a wonderful smell, and one difference is that it has teeth on its leaves, while Creeping Jenny does not. It also spreads much less. Yellow Archangel is a Class B noxious weed, originally introduced as an ornamental but quickly escaped home gardens. This plant is on the state quarantine list. It's an evergreen or semi-evergreen, fast-growing perennial ground cover that is in the mint family. It can grow in sun or shade. It is mostly trailing, but does grow upright when growing over other plants. Leaves are typically variegated with silver gray markings and grow on trailing four-sided stems. Yellow flowers, like many other flowering plants in the mint family, are two-lipped with a hood on top. Stems can root at leaf nodes and other places along the stem in wet soil. They can also reproduce by seed as well as stem fragments. This is one of those weeds that started out in hanging baskets and when dumped illegally spread into natural areas. This plant can be managed by hand pulling, although it is a little tougher than ivy if you've done that. Root and stem fragments easily break off and can resprout. Cutting is not advised. Also, the plants must be completely dried out before composting, or the safest bet is to just discard it in the garbage. Otherwise, the plants will reroot if left on the ground. Herbicide can be an effective tool. If you would like to know more about that, please just let me know. Italian Arum is an herbaceous perennial that was introduced as an ornamental and quickly escaped gardens. Because of its toxicity, ability to easily establish in riparian habitats, and because it is so hard to control, Italian Arum was designated as a Class C noxious weed in Washington. It was also just recently added to the quarantine list. An attractive plant often has variegated arrow-shaped leaves that emerge in the fall and in mild winters persist until the spring. It blooms from about April to June in what is called a spathe and spadix flower, and that's the photo on the right. These flowers apparently give off a displeasing odor. Typically, the leaves begin to die back as the fruit ripens, leaving just spikes of green to red berries. Italian Arum grows from the tubers and develops daughter tubers during the growing season. The following year, the daughter tubers break off and form new plants. Because of this, digging the plant or disturbing the soil increases the spread. Often infestations of arum are found in natural areas where yard debris has been dumped. We recently had a landowner contact us after he had received some quote-unquote free dirt from someone who was building a house. He was trying to fill in a low spot, and unfortunately the dirt he got contained thousands of tubers that formed new plants. The other unfortunate thing about Italian arum is that it's very difficult to control. Manual removal can be effective if you carefully dig up a plant, removing all soil, tubers, and roots, and discarding them in the garbage. This must be done for several years until no plants emerge. Larger infestations require multiple years of an herbicide treatment. We are currently conducting trials of our own and have found that imazapyr is reducing the population after 2 seasons. Keep in mind, Italian arum is a monocot, so broadleaf herbicides will not be effective. Using a non-selective herbicide like glyphosate or imazapyr can be. Okay, I think this is the last weed on our slides here. This is Lesser Celandine. It's a Class B noxious weed. It's a hairless perennial that emerges early in the season, this time of year, anywhere from January to February, and it spreads aggressively by tubers and bulbils, which are small bulb-like structures that grow on its stem, and it produces by seed. It really kind of is a cute plant, especially when blooming, but one of the unfortunate sides of this thing is that when it dies back after it blooms, there's nothing remaining but bare ground. It doesn't take long for this plant to expand and outcompete any grass or other ephemeral spring flowers. I've seen entire yards in Portland with this plant. And the unfortunate thing is that from about April until January, there's nothing in that yard but dirt. Plants grow up to about 12 inches tall in a mounded rosette, and there are both basal and stem leaves that are medium to dark green and kidney or heart-shaped. Solitary yellow flowers bloom at stem tips and are about 1 inch wide. Lesser celandine spreads easily as the tubers and bulbils are easily dislodged and spread by moving soil, mowing, and flooding. Often this plant ends up in natural areas where a homeowner has dumped their yard debris without knowing the consequences. There is a native that looks like this. It's called yellow marsh marigold, but the marigold does not have tuberous roots and does not produce bulbils, and it also blooms much later in the season in July or August. So now that we've talked about the plants, I want to review how weeds are spread. Some plants have sticky seeds that grab onto clothing or animal fur and are transported to new areas that way. Some plants have wind-borne seeds or seeds that float and move in water. And many plants have seeds that simply get picked up with dirt or mud on anything it clings to, like boots, tires, tools, and even mowers or brush control devices. Aquatic species can be moved via boats, trailers, and ballast systems, or by dumping live bait or unwanted fish aquariums. And those plants that reproduce via fragments or rhizomes are oftentimes spread by illegal or irresponsible yard debris dumping. Weeds can spread a number of ways, but there are things that you can do to minimize that spread and decrease the risk of invasive species. First, prevent the spread of noxious weeds and other invasives by cleaning boots, dogs, and bicycle tires. You should do this before and after heading out on the trail. You don't want to introduce anything new, and you don't want to take anything home with you. The same goes for equipment. Clean earth-moving equipment, mowers, and tools before and after visiting the worksite. Remember, come clean, leave clean. Use weed-free gravel, hay, or mulch when possible. Clean, drain, and dry your boat, waders, and gear between water sources, not only for plants, but pathogens and invertebrates that may be so small they can't be seen with the naked eye. Don't let exotic pets loose in the wild or dump yard debris in your natural areas. Buy firewood locally. And if you see something that doesn't belong or looks out of place, report it. See something, say something. Avoid wildflower seed mixes or buying seeds or plants over the internet. And if you can, avoid non-native ground covers and those plants that are labeled robust or easily spreads. Choose native plants to use less water and fertilizer over time, to provide habitat and food for wildlife, and to encourage beneficial insects that will decrease the need for pesticides. So again, be a yard guard. Know what you're buying and buy locally sourced native plants. See something, say something. Come clean and leave clean. Give invasive species the brush off. A couple of other things you can do to encourage the good or beneficials in your garden, especially for pollinators, is to avoid buying flowers or plants treated with neonicotinoids, which can harm bees and other insects. It should say right on the label or tag if it's been treated that way. Choose a variety of flowers, especially single flowers, as opposed to double flowered varieties that do not provide pollen, and try to cover 3 seasons of blooms in your garden from about February to October. Choose native plants. Also, many of our native pollinators nest in the ground, so leave bare ground for them to use. Be a messy gardener. Leave dead twigs and limbs for habitat and avoid cutting back your garden until early spring. When you do cut it back, leave standing dead stalks approximately 15 inches tall for bees that nest in hollow cavities. Leave the leaves in the fall. Overwintering pollinators like queen bumblebees need a place to hide from the elements and leaf litter. And leaf litter, twigs, sponge grasses, and rotting wood provide for that need. And lastly, provide a shallow water source for pollinators and other insects. Here are some other resources I want you to be aware of that could be useful for you in the future. The National Pesticide Information Center is hosted at Oregon State University and is a great resource for anything related to pesticides. They provide objective, science-based info about pesticides via publications, frequently asked questions, podcasts, and other outreach material, and you can actually call and talk to a highly trained staff person. I've also mentioned the State Weed Board and Invasive Species Council as valuable resources. And of course, you probably already know about the services provided by the Underwood Conservation District since you're here tonight. One other agency I want to mention is our local WSU Extension. We have one director in Skamania and Klickitat counties, Hannah Browse, and she's an excellent resource, especially in all things ag. If she doesn't know the answer to your question, she will do her best to find it for you, so please keep her in mind. And really, all of us are partners, and we'll be happy to help you find the right answer to your questions, no matter who you call. A great resource that is local to our area is the Columbia Gorge Cooperative Weed Management Area, or CWMA. This is a collaboration between public land and natural resource managers and private landowners. Weeds follow no boundaries. This group facilitates cooperation across political borders, allowing for the most effective and efficient weed management. Services they provide are education for both the general public and professionals. They host an email listserv that anyone can sign up for, where you receive news about weeds, events, and job postings. And just so you know, they are infrequent emails, and you can also opt out at any time. They host quarterly meetings where we try to bring in someone to speak on a specific topic for part of the meeting. And then also that we allow our partners to just share what's going on with them, ask questions of each other, and find answers from our constituents. The CWMA created the BMPs that I've been referring to tonight, and this info can easily be found on their website. They also host an annual invasive species and exotic pest workshop, which, by the way, is being held virtually this year and is free. So here's a little plug for that. Topics this year include climate change and how that will affect invasive species, eDNA, the Asian giant hornet, northern pike and flowering rush, and we also have the first speaker in the UCD's winter workshop, Elaine Harvey, talking about native foods, sources, and their habitats. There will also be a crowd favorite, which is an invasive species interactive quiz. It's going to be a good day of learning, and we welcome anyone to join us. You can find more info on the agenda on the CWMA website, as well as a link to register. And I'm pretty sure they're going to be recording this, so if you can't make it that day, you'll be able to view it on your own time. One more plug that Tova mentioned earlier. is a resource for you, and it's a local native plant and pollinator demonstration garden. This is located on the south side of the Hegewald Center next to the fairgrounds in Stevenson. We started the garden in 2017 with sheet mulching the area, and then planting started in 2018 and continued in 2019 and 2020. These are mostly native plants to Washington, and it does host a myriad of species. We are in the transition zone here in the Gorge, and so we've included both east side and west side plants. We have interpretive signs that showcasing why native plants are important, as well as facts about pollinators and the habitat they need to thrive. Many of the plants have name tags for easy identification. I encourage you to come take a look and to acquire ideas for plants you may want to install in your own garden. There's a brochure and a slideshow of the progress of the garden on our webpage. So here's my contact info. Our office is in Stevenson, just east of the Hegewald Center, and actually right next to the pollinator garden. So please stop by anytime. We work Monday through Thursday. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. That was a great presentation and a ton of good resources for us to all follow up with. I just want to take a minute and say that we are a couple of minutes over, so if you do have to leave us now, thank you for tuning in, and we appreciate seeing you tonight. But we will do some Q&A, so if you're able to hang on, that would be great. So I have a question here for you, Emily. Going back to Canada Thistle, when do you apply systemic herbicide for that?
So it depends on the herbicide that you're going to use, and the best way to find that information is on the label. It will tell you timing for that. Some herbicides that if you're using glyphosate, which will keep in mind also hurt your grass, but a good time to do that is early in the season. Another favorite one that I like to use is aminopyrrolid or milestone. It's a fairly new chemical on the market, and it can be applied pretty much anytime throughout the season, including in the fall.
Okay, great. We also had a question here for garlic mustard. Does garlic mustard also resemble rattlesnake weed?
Rattlesnake weed, I'm not exactly sure what that is. That's another one that with a common name could be a number of different things. Familiar with a rattlesnake orchid. Okay. So I'm sorry, I don't know what rattlesnake weed is.
Okay. If you want to clarify that a little bit, William, then we can try to answer that one for you. But for now, I will move on to a question about butterfly bush. Is butterfly bush considered a weed in Hood River County? Do you know? My neighbor has a lot of it in their yard.
More than likely it is. I'm not sure about if it is on the noxious weed list there, but one thing to kind of tell about butterfly bush is if you see it starting to pop up in areas where maybe it wasn't originally planted. So there's the original plant that was planted, and then there's a lot more daughter plants around that plant or in your yard, and that's probably the invasive one.
Great. And we had a comment too that there's butterfly bush in Hamilton Creek, which maybe you already know about, but FYI.
Okay. I'll make note of that.
Okay. Yeah, that is all I'm seeing for questions right now. We do have a comment, the excellent program, and thank you. So yeah, thank you so much, Emily, for being here and giving us all that great information. And I'm really excited about that Wildflower app that you mentioned. I've got to go get that one. So.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's been really fun tonight, and I'm so thankful for all of you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. That was fascinating. I think we all learned something tonight. It was so informative. And so now as we all go looking around in our own backyards or recreating out in our local gorge open spaces, we'll have a lot more to consider and think about and identify as we're out there. So if folks have other follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to either us at UCD or, of course, Emily by phone or email. So I think Jan's going to put up our contact info on a screen, and feel free to record that or look us up again on our website. And we hope to share all this information from Emily's slides and even a recording of this presentation on our webpage too. So look for that under news and events in maybe about a week. So with that, we want to thank you again, all of you, for joining us this evening. Thank you again, Emily. We hope to see you all soon at an event near you someday soon. And until then, please stay safe, everyone, and stay well. Good night.